Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. Dawn peeled open the sky over Bitter Creek, the way a careful hand opens a letter slow, deliberate, with a rip of orange along the seam. Jedediah Cole was already awake. He washed at the pump behind the cabin, the water shocking and clean, then stood for a pause, long enough to feel the first sunlight make an honest man out of the frost. The Bitter Creek Ranch lay quiet in that moment before the day's noise, the low corrugation of the hills, the wind dragging its knuckles in the buffalo grass, the faint shiver of the cottonwoods where the creek bent like a crooked-armed Jed was. A man built spare lean in the face, ropey in the forearms, boots chewed by weather and work. Folks called him the loner rancher, and he didn't argue. Solitude had a way of sanding a man down to the grain. He ate alone, rode alone, mended fence alone. Even his horse, a crow-boned bay gelding who answered to Pigeon for reasons Jed could no longer recall, had the taciturn manners of his owner. Pigeon didn't nicker when he saw Jed. He simply turned an ear. Out here, that counted as conversation. He finished washing and took his coffee on the threshold, where the old plank stoop had a habit of catching the morning sun just right. The coffee was strong enough to float a nail. He drank and watched. A line of antelope print themselves across a far ridge like beadwork on a moccasin. The silence was not empty. It was full of the small, shy sounds that made up his days, the whistle of a meadowlark, the slow yawn of the barn door, the creek talking to itself where the rocks were tight. He wasn't lonely, not exactly, not at first. When he'd taken over the spread after his father died, the work stood up and saluted him, and there hadn't been time for thinking. The winter would club a man to the ground if he didn't stay busy. But winters stacked up, even the mild ones, the way ledgers do. One night he'd counted the plates he owned, too, and realized he kept the second just to pretend there might be a guest. He'd laughed at himself, and then, for reasons he didn't examine, stopped laughing. The notion of marriage didn't arrive like lightning. It trickled into him the way creek water sneaks through gravel. He'd ride fence and imagine someone waiting with a skillet and a story about a hawk. He'd sit by the fire and look at the other chair, as if it might say something back. The quiet, once his partner, began to feel like a witness. The first nudge came from a handbill tacked to the wall of Whitcomb's Mercantile in town. He'd ridden in for salt, nails, and a bolt of canvas, and there, among advertisements for patent tonics and plows, was a neat printed card: widows and maidens seeking honest husbands in the territories. Agencies in Boston, St. Louis, and New Orleans. References upon request. Reply by post to Mrs. Eliza Fairweather, Boston, Massachusetts. He'd pretended not to see it. He bought his nails. He made a careful study of axe handles he didn't need. He said, "Morning, Miss Whitcomb," and she said, "Morning, Mr. Cole," in the way the two of them had been saying morning for 5 years. And somehow the card still hung there, a square little dare. On the ride home, the wind worked itself into his collar and stayed there, worrying him like a piece of gristle. The handbill did its own kind of worrying. He thought about it while he patched harness by lamplight, while he sorted the last of the dried beans, while he laid out his father's old pocket watch and wound it with the careful twist that kept the hours steady. He told himself it was foolish. He told himself a ranch didn't need a woman to be a ranch. He told himself many things, and none of them climbed down into the hollow part of him, where the truth had built a small house and shut the door. He wrote the letter on a Tuesday he would later remember for nothing else. The wind had been east. The sky had been ordinary. He'd cleaned the lamp chimney and sharpened the draw knife and put off the writing until he had run out of chores he could do inside without inventing new ones. Then he sat at the table with his father's stub pen and a bottle of ink that had been turned to glue by 3 summers and a stingy cork, And he began. The first line he drew shook a little, as if his hand had to find the road. He wrote, scratched. It out, wrote again. He didn't have the habit of letters, and what he did have in words was rough as fence cedar. He tried fancy starts, dear madam, dear agency, to whom it may concern, and none of them sounded like him. In the end he went simple, which was the only way he knew to be true. Ma'am, my name is Jedediah Cole. I keep a ranch at Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory. I can offer a clean house, food on the table, and steady work that will never run out. I am quiet by nature. I am not given to drink. I would be obliged to correspond with a woman of good sense and good heart, not particular as to looks or accomplishments, provided we can be companions. I value the quiet and hope to share it. Respectfully, J. Cole. He sanded the wet ink with a pinch of ash, folded the paper square, and addressed it in a hand that made the letters stand like fence posts. Mrs. Eliza Fairweather, Boston. He stared at the envelope until the corners of it seemed to soften. Then he looked away, like a man pretending he hadn't been staring at a window. He put on his coat. He saddled Pigeon. The world didn't tilt, but it did feel as if something. Inside, it had shifted one click forward. The road to town ran like a stitch through the sage. Bitter Creek, both the water and the place, took its name from a taste a man didn't forget quickly. The creek had a habit of sulking in summer and throwing a fit in spring, and the town did much the same. There were 12 buildings that counted if you weren't the man who owned the 13th. Whitcomb's Mercantile. The post office that was also the telegraph office when the wire wasn't down. The saloon with the front stoop that had given. Up and leaned back, the blacksmith, a livery, a feed store, a church that doubled as a school when the preacher's wife felt energetic, and a scattering of houses that kept their secrets. Men nodded at Jed the way men nod at weather there, constant, unremarkable, unless it turns out at the post office. Jed found Postmaster Albee sorting a slow rain of paper into pigeonholes. Albee had a nose like a hawk, and spectacles that made his eyes look like sorrowful oysters. He had 2 subjects, envelopes that arrived late and rheumatism that arrived early. He looked up at Jed and said, "No letters for you, just from habit." "Sending one?" Jed said, and put his envelope on. The counter, as if the wood might have opinions about it. Albee set a stamp on the corner and pressed it down with theatrical care. "Boston," he said, as though reading it aloud could keep the world from making a fool of itself. "That's a long way to go to ask a question." Jed tipped his hat and didn't answer. He rode home lighter, which was odd because he had a coil of new rope and 2 sacks of flour in the panniers. The letter had gone off into the country of chance. Being a rancher, Jed understood chance the way a gambler doesn't. He knew that honest work and weather make liars out of plans. All a man can do is mend the fence and show up at dawn. Days made their slow procession. Spring leaned into summer. The creek climbed out of its ditch and forgot itself in places. Calves were branded. A windmill came apart and went back up. A coyote learned not to visit the henhouse and then forgot again. Jed found that thinking about the letter took less effort than trying not to think about it. He let the thought live in his pocket like a penknife. On Fridays, he rode in for supplies and the mail. Sometimes there was a circular, sometimes nothing. Sometimes Albee's eyebrows did something sympathetic that Jed pretended not to see. When 6 weeks had passed, he told himself it was foolish to expect a reply, then told himself it was foolish to have expected one any sooner. The 7th Friday, a cloud sat low on the eastern horizon, and the wire at the telegraph office was singing like a wet saw. Albee handed Jed an envelope with Boston in the corner and an ink smell so new the stamp was still sulky. Jed didn't open it in town. He slipped it into his pocket and bought beans and coffee and a bar of lye soap and 2 yards of calico, not because he needed it, but because the feel of it in his hand seemed a proper kind of hope. Miss Whitcomb raised an eyebrow at the calico and then lowered it, her mouth doing a small, tidy smile that didn't touch anything else on her face. Jed kept his face plain as unbuttered bread. He opened the letter at home, on the stoop, with the creak talking louder than usual. The writing was even, the kind that looked like it could hold up a roof. It was not from Mrs. Fairweather, but from a woman whose name he didn't recognize. Mr. Cole, your letter was forwarded to me by Mrs. Fairweather with the suggestion that we might correspond. I am a woman of 33 years, raised in Missouri, lately in the employ of a boarding house. I am strong and healthy. I have known work all my life and am not frightened by it. I prefer the honest quiet you describe to the noisy foolishness I have learned too well. I am plain. I am not skilled at music or embroidery, but I can mend, cook, and ride. If this suits you, write me again and tell me of your place. Tell me what kind of sky you have. Respectfully, Martha Jane Harlan. He read the letter twice, then a third time for the way it made his chest feel full and careful at the same moment. She'd asked about the sky. No one had ever asked him about the sky. That night he wrote by lamp and let himself be ungainly on the page. He told her the sky at Bitter Creek was a promise most mornings and a warning in the afternoon. He told her the wind behaved like a neighbor who borrowed things and forgot to return them. He told her the house was small but honest, and the land was larger than a man could ever fully own. He said there was work, and then more work, and then the way the light caught on the creek late in the day and turned the whole bend into a silvery road to nowhere in particular. He mentioned the hens by name without meaning to. He folded the letter and felt the foolishness in his chest smile and sit up straight. Weeks followed letters the way tracks follow hooves. They traded pages that carried bread and butter facts, how many head had gone to market, how a stove chimney ought to be brushed, the right way to split a skirt stake from a side, and other things that lived in the margins. She asked after the meadowlarks. He sent a feather in an envelope and apologized when it broke through the paper and went missing. He told her about a sudden storm that had walked in on a Sunday afternoon and drunk his best hat. She told him about a girl at the boarding house who could sing like a creek in April, and about the kettle that had wont to spit at her unless spoken to kindly first dot by midsummer. Her letters had the heft of a habit. The last one came in handwriting that had learned to be bolder just in the writing to him. Mr. Cole Jed, if you allow, I have no ties that bind me here. I prefer to be useful where I am needed. If your mind is set, I will come by the late summer. Stage as far as your town runs, and if you will meet me there, I will be ready to make a home. As to your question, do I mind the quiet? I have been searching for it. Yours, M.J. Harlan Jed, set the letter down and went outside because the cabin had abruptly become smaller than a breath. He looked at the sky he had told her about and tried to see it as a thing a woman might cross the country to share. Then he set to work the way he always did when the world had given him something fine and he was afraid to look at it too long. He scrubbed the cabin until the boards remembered their grain. He planed the table edges where his father had gouged them, repaired the ladder to the loft, hammered a new strip along the door where the wind liked to come in and borrow the warmth. He patched the roof, even though it hadn't asked. He sanded and oiled the second chair, the one that had been good enough for a visitor, but not for a wife. He made shelves crooked at first, then truer, and stacked them with jars he filled in a frenzy of putting by. Beans, dried apples, flour sifted and set aside in muslin sacks, as if flour could understand the significance of being arranged neatly dot-at. The mercantile he bought a mirror, no larger than a handspan, and felt like a thief walking it to the counter. He bought a blue ribbon, because the calico from Boston still lived in the bottom of a drawer and he feared superstition. Miss Whitcomb said, "Those are nice things," and he nodded as if nice were a word he owned. A town saw him, the way small towns do when there is finally something to see. Someone said, "So, Jed?" And he said nothing and paid for nails. The day the stage was due, the wind took a holiday. Heat lay over Bitter Creek like an extra blanket nobody wanted. Jed wore his good shirt, which was to say the one with buttons that agreed with their holes, and a hat that had been to hot water and a careful reshaping. He left Pigeon at the livery and stood in the shade of the false front of the post office, where the paint still insisted on being white. Men arranged themselves like fence posts along the street. Women found errands that required the precise timing of the stage's arrival. Even the telegraph wire seemed to draw its buzz into a listening hush. Red Tucker drove the stage that day, a man with a beard like a burned haystack and an attitude that most things could be solved by cracking. A whip near them. The coach rattled into view in a swing and a hiss, dust throwing itself up in approval. It pulled to, the horses blowing, the leather straining, the door wedged open with a practiced boot. A boy climbed down carrying a parcel that was all elbows. A woman in a green hat descended as if each step were the first step she'd ever taken. And a traveling drummer followed, announcing his wares to no one in particular. "Jed Cole." Red Tucker called, catching sight of him. "Got a passenger says she's yours." Jed felt his spine arrange itself without asking. He was not a man who startled. He had seen a spring thaw take a fence line in one gulp and a bull thrash itself against a snake, and the first snow lay down like a soft argument that would last months. Still, something in his chest did a thing like a colt, remembering it had legs. The last passenger ducked under the stage door. She did not climb down so much as step out, the coach accommodating her the way furniture accommodates a man who knows where he is going to sit. Her bonnet was tied firm and looked small in the way a teacup looks small on a carpenter's bench. She wore a traveling dress in a shade of brown that conceded nothing to dust. The first fact of her was size taller than Jed by a clear head, and broader in the shoulders than many a man who had ever worked a team. The second fact was how comfortable she seemed inside that size, the way a good horse is comfortable in its stride. The third was her eyes, which found him in the crowd the way a hand finds the latch of a familiar door. The street rearranged itself. Silence broke into murmurs, as if someone had walked through a field and 1,000 grasshoppers had leapt at once. Jed was aware of the scrape of Red Tucker's boot and the soft, wheeled complaint of the drummer's sample case and the swoop of his own breath. He took one step forward. She took two. "Mr. Cole?" she said, voice carrying like a bell. Dad had no need to shout that. He tipped his hat. "Mom." Her mouth did a thing halfway between a smile and a squint against the sun. She shifted her traveling trunk as if it had the weight of a loaf of bread and let it rest by her boot. The dust around her hem decided to settle down and behave. No one moved. Even the telegraph line seemed to be listening for what came next. Jed, who had thought he understood the scale of his world, the length of a fence, the distance to town, the width of his own solitude, stood there and felt that map redraw itself in an instant. Whatever he had imagined stepping off that stage, it wasn't the fact of her, undeniable as a thunderhead. The quiet inside him did not go away. It opened. He cleared his throat, found his hands empty, and for the first time in a very long time, felt his life tilt towards something that might be called company. Red Tucker flicked dust off his gloves like he was brushing crumbs from a tablecloth and said to the street at large, "Well, ain't this a day?" which was the kind of comment a man made when he was pleased to have a front row seat at a spectacle he didn't have to pay for. Heads leaned out of windows. A pair of boys abandoned their game of mumbly peg. Even Miss Whitcomb, who usually held the expression of a woman correcting arithmetic, allowed herself a look that could have been curiosity. The woman set her trunk down with a polite thud and faced Jed as if the crowd were just weather they'd both agreed to ignore. "Mr. Cole," she said again. "I'm Martha Jane Harlan, though most call me Mattie. Been a long trip? You as good in person as on paper?" Jed found his hat brim and tugged it like a man checking whether his head was still attached. "Hope so," he said. "I ain't worse, anyhow." Her laugh was a short, warm roll of thunder. She offered her hand and closed it around his, like a smith taking a piece of iron he intended to shape. It wasn't a challenge. It was merely that she came at life with her whole hand. Yet's knuckles survived, but they had a story to tell. Afterward, "Welcome to Bitter Creek," he managed. "You must be dusty and hungry." "Both," she said cheerfully. "Mostly ready to stop moving and look around where I'm supposed to be." The townsfolk arranged themselves into a half-circle polite enough to pretend it wasn't a circle. Miss Whitcomb pinched a smile back into thinness and stepped forward with a folded paper in her hand like a woman presenting a hymn. "Reverend Tolliver is at the church," she said. "He's expecting you to, should you wish to." She paused, found a word that pleased her. "Formalize." Mattie tipped her bonnet to the mercantile window, which had never received a curtsy before, and didn't quite know what to do with it. "That so, Jed?" Jed looked at Mattie, and the question she'd asked in her letter, "Do I mind the quiet?" ran back across the miles as if it had been waiting for this exact minute to arrive. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon we ought." They didn't make a parade out of it. The church was a one-room box. It smelled of pine and chalk and, faintly, of the spilled kerosene someone had been promising to clean up since Easter. Mrs. Tolliver had put a jar of wildflowers on the lectern, and the sun had arranged itself to look kindly through the wavering glass. Reverend Tolliver, a bony man whose calling had whittled him down to essentials, shook Yet's hand and Mattie's, then nodded like a carpenter who approved of the wood he'd been given. "Do you have witnesses?" he asked, peering over spectacles that enjoyed sliding down his nose more than he enjoyed pushing them back up. "We do," Miss Whitcomb said, with Postmaster Albee already nodding beside her, the two of them having somehow arrived ahead of everyone else without moving faster than they ever did. Red Tucker leaned in the doorway like a punctuation mark. A boy with a cowlick stuck his head in and gaped until the reverend's eyebrows sent him packing. Jed reached into his vest pocket and thumbed his father's ring. The band had a nick where a hinge had caught it, and the gold had been worn smooth by a hand that had known both temper and tenderness. He had cleaned it the night before and sat with it on the table as if it might say something. Now he held it up, a small, bright promise. "I ain't a poet," Jed said softly to Mattie, the words nearly falling off the narrow shelf he'd built for them. "But I can tell the truth." "Truth will do," Mattie said, eyes steady. Spoke vows that had lived long lives in other mouths, making them new by the simple fact of meaning them. Jed promised to work, to keep faith, to share his bread and his silence. Mattie promised to keep a home, to shoulder what came, to stand beside him where the wind cut hard. The ring slid onto her finger and looked surprised to be there, then pleased. When it was done, Reverend Tolliver said, "That's the work on it," and Mrs. Tolliver hugged them both and left flour marks where her apron met Mattie's sleeve. Outside, Red Tucker clapped his hands once and barked, "Saloons? Got sarsaparilla on ice and whiskey that thinks it is." Miss Whitcomb sniffed, at which the whiskey pretended not to take offense. Albee shook Yet's hand in a way that said he was proud of the male, in general, for having brought this about. They celebrated in the only way Bitter Creek knew, simply with mugs pressed into hands and a plate of Mrs. Tolliver's cookies making this rounds as if escorted by the territorial marshal. Jed drank sarsaparilla and tasted a sweetness he had never noticed in it before. Maddie let the whiskey kiss her lip, considered it, and said, "I've met worse men." Red Tucker, enchanted, proposed they arm wrestle for sport, at which Mrs. Tolliver proposed he carry the wedding cookies to the school children as penance for the suggestion. He did both. When it was time to go, Maddie declined the stage's offer to haul her trunk up to the ranch. "I got it," she said, and proved it, lifting the thing onto Yet's buckboard as if hefting the end of a table while someone else swept. "Underneath, you ride," Jed said, half out of courtesy and half because he wanted to see how she sat a saddle. "Gladly," she said, fun sparking at the edge of her mouth. "Side saddles for parlor steps. Have you got a horse that doesn't mind honesty?" "Bluebell don't lie," Jed said, and saddled the rangy roan Mari he rode when he needed a horse with opinions. Pigeon watched them both with a long-suffering eye that said change was a thing to be endured like weather and repaired around. Afterward, they set out in the late afternoon, the town talking itself back into its usual shape behind them. Dust rose in reluctant puffs. The wire sang faintly. The land opened, and with it, relief. Jed felt the prickle between his shoulder. Blades fade as the buildings fell away, and the sky stretched out like a canvas, showing its whole unrolled self. "Bitter Creek?" Maddie said, after a while, as if trying the name in her mouth. "It bite?" "Sometimes," Jed said. "Mostly it sulks. Floods when it remembers to." She rode steady, shoulders easy, hands quiet. Bluebell tried a test or two, and then conceded. She had been assigned a handler rather than a passenger. They crossed the low ford, where the water flicked up at hooves, and the dragonflies lit a string of blue beads along the bank. Maddie tipped her face to the breeze and let out a breath that traveled a long way. "Smells like someone washed the world," she said. "It's wrong as often as it's right," Jed said, and felt foolish for the warning as soon as he gave. Me too," Maddie said lightly. "We'll get along." He told her the names of the ridges the way a man introduces family. Long Table, Split Knuckle Widow's Thumb. She pointed at a hawk riding a heat current and asked, "What do you call that?" And he said, "Lunch," and she laughed again. A big-souled sound that made the cottonwoods along the creek pretend they weren't listening. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had moved into that tender hour where it considers the day and decides not to take any of it back. The roof shingles wore their repairs like careful stitches. The small garden squatted hopeful beside the door, beans reaching, squash already plotting mischief. Pigeon blew and shook himself like a dog. The hens clucked in a tone that suggested news they would share if anyone asked the right questions. Maddie swung down, tied Bluebell to the post, and stood with her hands on her hips, not judging so much as measuring. "Jed," she said, "you told the truth." He waited for the rest. "It's small," she said. "It's clean, it's yours, which makes it mine now, I think." "That's the arithmetic," he said. Inside, the cabin took her in the way a room learns the size of its furniture the first time it's moved. Jed felt briefly like he had led a draft horse into a pantry, then watched as the room adjusted, stretching in the places it could, lowering its shoulders where it had to. Maddie set her bonnet on the peg by the door and wiped dust from her face with a handkerchief that had seen more road than linen just. Her hair thick, practical, stubborn, refused to be less than itself when the pins came out. She walked the perimeter of the cabin with the same paying attention she'd used on Bluebell, and the cabin, like the Mare, did a small inward nod. She tested a chair, glanced up the ladder to the loft, opened the stove door, and hummed at the ash pattern like a woman reading fortunes. "You've been cooking," she said, "and not badly. But you've been feeding the stove more wood than it needs. Should do it on less if you bank her right. You can tell that by ash?" Jed asked, impressed in a place that had nothing to do with pride. You can tell most things by what's left over, she said. Where ought I put the flour? He had imagined ceremony. What he got was partnership, which felt better. He showed her the shells he'd planed flat with his loneliness. She put her palm to them, approving, and lined jars on them with a quiet efficiency that thrilled him, for reasons he didn't think to name. They took the evening's work together, without asking who would do what. He fetched water. She strained it for the kettle. He brought in kindling. She built a small, disciplined fire that took to the stovepipe without sulking. He showed her the little garden. She harvested with hands that knew the pull of pea vines. He ground coffee. She kneaded dough with patient strength, the flour ringing the bowl like a drum of snow. When supper reached the table, it looked like they had lived together for years. Skillet bread steaming, beans buttered and peppered, slices of cold beef, quick pickled onions so new, they were still surprised to be elsewhere than the garden. Mattie bowed her head for a breath and said a grace that was mostly gratitude for hands and heat and the chance to use both. Jed, not a man given to prayers where anyone could hear them, found he liked the way hers sounded in the room. They ate, with healthy silence, the kind that happens when a day has been well handled. After a while, Mattie said, I cooked for 30 at a boarding house outside Independence. You think you don't like people? Try cooking for 30 of them. You learn something every meal about what you meant to do and what you actually did. I liked the work and hated the noise. I'm partial to a fight if it's honest, but I got tired of fighting folks' foolishness. You just left? Jed asked. I just left, she said. Paid up my totals, packed my trunk, wrote to Boston and to you. People told me I was too big to slip away. I said big things move quiet when they want to. He thought of the train. She must have taken the stage, the miles of looking out a window at a world that kept not being Bitter Creek. You brave, he said, and the word came out plain and without embroidery, the way a fence post stands. Hungry, she corrected, for the right kind of quiet. After supper, he made coffee from habit, and she accepted a tin cup of it like a treaty. They sat on the stoop with the day cooling around them and looked at the timid stars that had begun to test the sky. The creek muttered in the bend. Somewhere a coyote cleared his throat and decided against it. You named your hens? She asked. Only the ones that complain, he said. Seemed fair. She laughed, then sobered, with a thought. Tomorrow I'll see about that bed, she said, peering in through the door at the piece of furniture that had not anticipated her. You and me are going to sleep like two boards in a barrel if we don't widen it. You got spare planks? In the shed, he said. I thought on it, but I didn't want to presume. The confession felt uncharacteristic, and to his. Surprise good. You can presume I like a bed I don't have to fold myself into, she said. And I'll presume you like waking up without splinters. He nodded. The night did its slow work of unstring the day. When he reached to hang the lantern, his elbow nearly brushed her shoulder, and he realized, with a shock like stepping into cold water, that the world now included the fact of her in all the places it might. We'll do it gradual, she said, reading him without prying. There's time. Doesn't all have to be tonight. Reckon not, he said, and felt the relief and the ache of that truth at once. They made up the bed as best it could be made, and then made pallets on knee. Floor besides. A compromise offered and accepted without comment. Jed lay awake long enough to listen to her breathing, find a steady road. He found his own and walked along after it. In the gray just before dawn, when the sky is a held breath and the birds are sharpening their songs, Mattie was already up. The pump handle complained once and then gave in. She returned with water and, without fuss, set bread to rise for the day. Jed watched from the doorway, boots in hand, feeling the oddness of not needing to fill the air with motion, just to keep his thoughts from slipping. Work started early and held on to them with both hands. Mattie moved through the yard and the barn with a calm attention that measured, fixed, and learned. She stood beside Bluebell and found the mare's itchy spot with a scratch that made the chung. Animal closed one eye in gratitude. She checked the henhouse and came out with 2 eggs and a remark about a raccoon that had tried and failed to be clever. She saw where a fence wire had given up and told Jed before he could tell her. Rustled? She asked, squinting toward the north pasture. Not yet, he said, but I've heard about a crew sniffing at the edges of folks' places, cutting a strand or two to test how quick a man notices. She set hands on her hips and narrowed her gaze until the distance came closer in self-defense. Well, she said, we'll notice. He didn't miss the we. It settled into him like a weight that felt exactly right. By mid-morning, they had widened the bed planks, planed and pegged, legs braced, the whole of it looking surprised at itself and then proud. Mattie handled a saw with the ease of someone who had discovered early that tools did not come with instructions, but did come with handles. She measured with her fingers and her eye, and the measure came out true. Where'd you learn? Jed asked, brushing curls of pine off the floor with the side of his boot. Barns fall down and kitchens need shelves, she said simply. Somebody picks up the hammer. Often that was me. They ate cold beef and new bread in the shade and left the door open so the cabin could learn this new pattern of air. A neighbor rode by a man named Hollis, who treated his hat as if it were his firstborn and pulled up when he saw Mattie. He adjusted his hat twice, as if 2 adjustments would equal 1 proper greeting, and tried on a smile that fit like a borrowed shirt. Mrs. Cole, he said. The words still had shine on them. Heard the news. Fine day for it. Mattie stood, brushed crumbs from her skirt, and gave him a nod that would have satisfied a judge. Mr. Hollis, she said. Pleasure. You? Need anything while you're turned out this way? Hollis blinked. No, ma'am. Just looking at the weather, he said, as if weather had suddenly required brave attendance. He tipped his hat again and rode on, his look over his shoulder not unkind, just adjusting to the fact the world sometimes changed shape and expected you to still ride through it. Afternoon brought heat and small chores, mending harness, setting a trap for the raccoon, washing shirts so they could get dusty again in honest fashion. Mattie took Yet's shirts off the line and folded them with a brisk pat that seemed to promise the day would put them to use. Jed replaced a gate hinge and pretended not to stand every so often in the doorway, just to be capable of the sight of her in his yard. Toward evening, a low bank of cloud slid in from the west, the underside of it the color of hammered lead. The light turned strange and fine, as if the world had been polished and then breathed on. Jed smelled rain and the iron wake of lightning that wasn't yet, but would be. Storm, he said. Good, Mattie said. Let it scrub what needs scrubbing. They buttoned down what a storm knows to look for tools that will go walking. A door that will swing and let rain take the house. Wood that will sponge up trouble if left where it lies. The first drops came fat and casual. The second were less forgiving. Thunder considered the situation and then announced its decision from a distance. The creek, always an opportunist, cleared its throat. Inside, the room glowed with the amber of a lamp turned just high enough to be generous and not so high as to be foolish. The storm shouldered around the cabin, testing the new pegs in the bed with a hand along the wall, finding them stout. Mattie poured coffee that picked up the light and turned it into something a man could swallow. They stood near the door, like farmers at a barn dance, not touching, already partnered. Lightning showed the land in a new set of closed silver. Grass, black sky, the fence a stitched seam across the hill. In that bright flicker, Jed saw Maddie's face lifted and unafraid, the line of her cheek untroubled. She looked powerful without trying, and gentle without announcing it. "You happy? You came?" he asked, not because he doubted, but because a man ought to ask a question whose answer he wants to live by. She didn't turn to him to answer. She kept her gaze on the storm and let it hear as well. "I am," she said. "I will be, if we keep telling the truth and doing the work. You ain't small, Jed Cole, even if I am bigger. There's room in you." He took that in and set it where he put the best things, the ones that were too lively to stay in a drawer. Thunder rolled closer and then away. Rain washed the dust from the porch and tamped it down into something like a promise. Somewhere, a fox barked once in irritation and once in approval. The storm moved on, deciding the creek had been sufficiently scolded for one night. They ate their supper-late stew, bright with onion and the last of the garden carrots that had mistaken themselves for spring again, and afterward Matty took down his father's pocket watch, wound it, and set it on the shelf with the same care you give a sleeping child. She looked around the cabin and then at him. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll go to town and get a second washtub, if they'll part with one, and some muslin, and I'll need lye. We'll set a sourdough. I'll show you what a biscuit can decide to be when it's not bullied." "Tomorrow," he agreed, "and I'll show you the north pasture. You ought to see where the snow stacks up mean. And there's a cottonwood up that way that keeps secrets." "Good," she said, and yawned like a woman who had worked well and deserved the sleep she was going to take. "Also, I'll want a shotgun where I can put my hand on it without thinking about it." He looked at her, surprised only that she had waited until page 2 of their life to say it. "Behind the door," he said, "loaded but not cocked." She nodded, satisfied. The world slowed to its night rhythm, the plunk and sigh of cooling wood, the creek story lengthening, as if it had decided to add a chapter. They banked the stove and left the lamp low and called the day done. Jed lay under the new, wider bedstead, listening to the comfortable ticks and pops of a house that had accepted change and found it fit. He thought of the map of his life, the lines he'd drawn, and the places he hadn't known to name. He thought of Maddie's hand on Bluebell's neck, and her laugh in the street, and the way she had said, "We'll notice," like an oath. He thought, briefly, of the rustlers the neighbors had half-whispered about, and of the fact that the door latch felt more faithful than it had yesterday without having physically changed Dot above him. Maddie turned once and settled. The bed answered with a creak that had more pleasure than complaint in it. The rain eased into memory. Outside, the sky began to repopulate itself with stars. "Good night, Jed," she said into the new quiet, and the words landed easy, not claiming anything they hadn't earned. "Good night, Maddie," he said, and felt the hollow place he knew so well go from empty to open, which is not the same thing and better. Tomorrow would come with its list, and he found himself eager for it. On the peg by the door, the shotgun waited. On the shelf, the watch ticked. In the yard, the hens muttered about weather. And in the small, honest house at Bitter Creek, a loner. And a woman twice his size lay down in the width they had made, partners to whatever came next. Asterisk, the first weeks passed like a river after thaw fast, full and carrying more than Jed could have believed. He had expected adjustment to be slow, like a mule taking to new harness. But Maddie's presence slipped into the grooves of his days with a naturalness that left him wondering how he'd ever thought to manage without it. Dot. At dawn, she was up. Before him, pulling water from the pump, her strong back bent in a way that looked like work and grace together. By breakfast, the smell of biscuits, real biscuits, not the hard cakes he'd convinced himself were acceptable, floated from the stove. She took to the stock as if she'd been raised to it, speaking low to the calves, standing her ground. When the bull tried to test her, and rushing down Bluebell, until the mare followed her around the yard like a dog. Jed watched this in silence, the kind of silence that was different from the old kind. Before, the quiet had been hollow. Now it was full stuffed with the rhythm of two people working side by side, saying little, meaning much. But the prairie had a way of testing new things. Rumors in town. First hint came on a Saturday when Jed and Mattie rode into Bitter Creek for flour, sugar, and a new draw knife. At the livery, they found Tom Hollis talking low with two other ranchers. Hollis was a man who disliked being surprised, and his voice carried the sharpness of a man who had been. 3 head gone in the night, he was saying. Fence cut clean, not broke. That's men's work, not coyotes. The other rancher spat in the dust. Same happened down by Cottonwood Ford. They're testing us. I seen boot prints. Where? There oughtn't be. Big ones. Hollis noticed Jed and Mattie and cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward Mattie, as if measuring how much of this talk ought to reach her ears. Morning. Cole, Hollis said stiffly. Ma'am. Morning, Jed replied. He could feel Mattie's eyes on him, steady, waiting for truth. Trouble? She asked. Hollis hesitated. Just mutterings, rustlers maybe. Best keep watch, is all. Jed nodded. He bought his flour, his sugar, and the draw knife. But the words stuck to him like burrs. All the ride home got tracks in the dusty week later. Jed saw it for himself. He'd gone to check the north pasture, where the grass stretched thick and the sky seemed to press closer to the earth. At first glance, all was as it should be, cattle grazing, tails swishing, no sign of spook. But then his eyes caught the line where the fence had been cut. Not trampled, not pulled by storm, but snipped sharp and deliberate. Boot tracks marked the dust just beyond. Broad prints, 3 men at least, walking light but not careful enough. The herd had been driven a short distance before being turned. Back-testing, just as the ranchers in town had said. When Jed returned, Mattie was in the yard, splitting kindling with strokes that sent the wood popping clean. He told her what he'd seen. She set the axe down and crossed her arms, her brow knitting. He'll be back, she said flatly. I know it. Well then, she said, we best be ready. There was no fear in her voice, only the plain steadiness of someone who had chosen her ground. Preparing for trouble, the days that followed took on a new rhythm. Jed mended the fence lines with wire and care, checking each post twice. Mattie cleaned the shotgun, broke open the rifle, and showed Jed how she loaded with a speed that came from practice. Where'd you learn? He asked, surprised at her. Sure hands. My pa believed a girl should shoot straighter than a boy who brags, she said, sliding a cartridge home. And I was always twice the size of my brothers, so he put me on the farthest target. Jed allowed himself a small smile. Looks like he was right. At night, they sat by the fire, the cabin warm with lamplight, while outside the prairie lay quiet and waiting. Coyotes yipped far off, and the creek muttered. Jed listened to Mattie's voice as she told stories of Missouri, of a river that could drown a town without a whisper, of children at the boarding house who fought over scraps of pie. She had lived through noise and found her way to quiet. That, he thought, was its own kind of courage. But every so often, his eyes drifted to the shotgun by the door. The confrontation, the rustlers came on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after the cut fence. The air was heavy with the smell of an oncoming storm, though no rain had yet fallen. The cattle shifted restless in the dark. Jed had been half asleep when Pigeon snorted, stamping hard in the corral. He rose, heart thudding, and Mattie was already up, pulling her boots on, hair braided tight. From habit, she lifted the shotgun from its peg and handed Jed the rifle. Lantern? Jed whispered. No, she said. Light gives us away. Moon'll do. They stepped into the yard. The silver light painted the grass, the barn, the long line of fence. And beyond it shadows moving, low and careful, where shadows had no business. Yet's finger curled near the trigger. 3 of them. I see 4, Maddie said quietly, her eyes sharper than his dot. The figures drew closer. 1 man slipping through the fence line, another swinging the cut wire aside. Maddie's voice rang out, sudden as thunder. You boys. Best turn tail, for I put daylight through your breeches. The night held still. The rustlers froze, not expecting a woman's voice, least of all one that rolled across the prairie like iron on iron. Jed raised his rifle. You're on my land, last chance. One of the men spat, his teeth catching moonlight. We don't take orders from a slip of a rancher. Maddie stepped forward into the moon, broad-shouldered, tall, the shotgun steady in her arms. Then maybe you'll take him from me. There was laughter short, nervous, but it died quick. Something about the sight of her, firm as a stone. Wall, carried weight the prairie couldn't mock. Jed fired a shot into the dirt, a yard from the man's boots. Dust kicked up. The cattle bawled, restless. The rustlers muttered among themselves, then turned, melting back into the night, curses trailing behind them. Maddie lowered the shotgun slowly, her eyes still on the fence. They'll think twice, she said. Jed let out the breath he'd been holding. He looked at her, the woman twice his size, the woman who had stepped off a wagon and into his life, and felt the strange, fierce pride of knowing he wasn't alone anymore. By the fire back inside. The fire crackled low. Jed sat with the rifle across his knees. Maddie poured 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling in the lamplight. You reckon they'll come again? He asked. Rustlers are like storms, she said, handing him a cup. They circle back until the land teaches 'em different. But we'll be here, you and me. Jed met her eyes. There was no doubt in them, no hesitation, just certainty. He sipped the bitter coffee, warm in his chest. Didn't reckon on you being my kind of woman, he said quietly. Maddie grinned, slow and wide. Didn't reckon on you being worth the fight, Jed Cole. Guess we both got surprised. The storm outside finally broke, rain drumming on the roof. But inside the cabin, 2 people sat shoulder to shoulder, steady as bedrock, ready for whatever the prairie decided to send next. The rustlers did not vanish. Prairie men never do. They slipped back into the night with muttered curses and spooked horses. But they carried away something more dangerous than stolen cattle. They carried pride wounded and pride in the West. Had a way of loading its own rifle. A tense summer, the days after the confrontation were thick with watchfulness. Jed rode the pastures twice daily, checking each fence strand with the patience of a man who'd learned that trouble usually advertised itself in small signs before it shouted. Maddie carried the shotgun to the yard each morning like she was, carrying a bucket of water, no drama in it, only necessity. Word traveled faster than wagons. By the time Jed rode into town again, the saloon buzzed with talk of the Cole place. They say that new wife of his stood off a whole gang, whispered one rancher over a mug. Big as a bear and twice as mean, another answered, though his tone was more admiring than mocking. Rustlers'll come back sure as thunder, but they won't find easy pickings there, added Hollis, with a note of reluctant respect. Jed felt eyes on him as he collected nails and lamp oil. He kept his face plain, but inside something stirred. Mix of pride and unease. Pride, because Maddie had proven herself steel-true. Unease, because a ranch that became a story often became a target. Maddie, hearing the same talk later from Mrs. Tolliver at the church, only laughed. Let them wag their tongues. The louder they talk, the quieter the rustlers'll try to sneak. That's to our advantage. Jed found himself wondering, not for the first time, if Providence hadn't sent him more than a bride, maybe a partner forged for this hard land. The return of the rustlers, it happened on a moonless night, when even. The creek sounded nervous. Jed woke to Pigeon's warning snort and the cattle's uneasy bawling. Maddie was already up, her braid loose down her back, shotgun in hand. "They're here," she said simply. This time there was no testing. 4 riders came hard at the herd, ropes swinging, intent on driving cattle before them. Yet's rifle cracked, a warning shot into the sky, but the rustlers pushed on. Maddie didn't hesitate. She strode into the yard, lantern in one hand, shotgun in the other. She raised the light high, casting her broad figure across the pasture like a giantess out of scripture. "Drop them ropes, or I'll drop you," she bellowed, her voice carrying over the pounding hooves. The herd shifted, confused, but the rustlers reined in. One cursed under his breath. Another spat. They hadn't counted on that same towering woman facing them down a second time. Jed leveled his rifle. "This land ain't yours. Leave while you've still got horses under you." For a moment, the prairie held its breath. Then the leader, a narrow man with a crooked hat brim, tugged his horse's head and snarled, "Ain't worth the trouble." With that, they wheeled and thundered back into the dark, the sound of their retreat fading into the empty miles. Maddie lowered the lantern, her chest rising and falling. "Reckon they finally understand." Jed exhaled slowly, his rifle still, hot in his hands. "Reckon they do." Respect earned the next morning, Jed and Maddie rode to town to report the attempt. By the time they tied their horses outside the post office, half the town already knew. Hollis clapped Jed on the shoulder, nearly dislodging his hat. "You and your missus saved more than your own stock last night," Hollis said gruffly. "Them rustlers'll think twice before sniffing around any of us again. Folks are beholden." Even Miss Whitcomb, who seldom praised anyone outside of Scripture, softened her usual severity. "Mrs. Cole," she said, her lips twitching at the corners, "you've shown this town what a woman can do. Bitter Creek will not forget." Maddie, unbothered by attention, only nodded. "I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here to work and keep house with Jed, but I won't let thieves undo what honest hands mend." The townsfolk murmured approval. Jed felt heat in his ears, a shy pride that had little to do with himself and everything to do with the woman at his side. Seasons turned summer baked itself into dust and gave way to autumn gold. The herd fattened. The garden swelled. Together, Jed and Maddie cut hay, stacked it in the barn, and sealed the cabin against the cold. At night, they read by lamplight, Jed stumbling through words, Maddie patient and teasing. When the first snow came, soft and thick, Jed found himself watching Maddie through the window as she hauled water, her breath clouding in the air. She moved with a steadiness that warmed him better than the fire. Inside, over stew and bread, Jed spoke quietly. "Didn't reckon I'd ever find someone to share this place. Thought Bitter Creek was only big enough for one." Maddie met his eyes, her smile slow and sure. "That's where you were wrong, Jed Cole. Bitter Creek's big enough for 2 who know how to stand together." He reached across the table, rough hand meeting hers, calluses greeting calluses. No words followed. None were needed. The heart of Bitter Creek by spring, the story of the loner rancher and his towering bride, had traveled farther than Bitter Creek. Riders passing through told it in Cheyenne, and even as far as Denver, a tale of how rustlers were turned by a woman with a voice like thunder and a man who found his courage, doubled in her shadow. But in the cabin by the bend of the creek, it was no tale, only life. Days of work, nights of warmth, seasons rolling like wagon wheels. Yet silence had found its echo, and Maddie's strength had found its match. The prairie would still test them storms. Lean years, the endless labor of keeping land tamed, but they were no longer alone in the fight. Together, they were Bitter Creek's heart, steady as the cottonwood, strong as the stones in the creek bed. And every Friday, when the stage rumbled into town, Jed would glance at it and remember the day she first stepped down the woman twice. His sighs who had filled his empty life, not just with thunder, but with laughter and love.